Let's turn our attention now to various literary observations arising from the books of 1st and 2nd Kings. We'd like to observe that what we find here in the presentation of history with its moralization has come to be known as the Deuteronomistic history, of Israel. That is to say, the history of Israel told through a Deuteronomistic lens. What we mean by that is a lens that's characterized by particular interest to, or interest in, evaluating the behavior of the nation against the criteria that are presented in the book of Deuteronomy. Consequently, when we encounter parts of the books of 1st and 2nd Kings that issue a moral judgment towards the close of one of the king's reigns, saying this was a good king because he wholeheartedly followed God and he tore down the high places and destroyed false idols of false worship, we would say, well, that comports well with the priorities that we find in the book of Deuteronomy. Consequently, this would fit how someone steeped in the book of Deuteronomy would assess the character of the nation for that particular king's rule. And conversely, if we have a king who is wicked, then that is characterized by behavior that would violate principles laid out in the book of Deuteronomy. Here's another layer of the label Deuteronomistic history. If one espouses the view that Deuteronomy was written during the exile, or at least during the reign of Josiah, then it follows that this whole evaluation of Israel's problem, that is to say, why it is that the northern and southern kingdoms fell, once again, if we espouse the point of view that Deuteronomy was written very late, then when the term Deuteronomistic history is used regarding the books, say, Kings and Chronicles, that label will bring with it the connotation or the assumption that such an assessment of the nation, the assessment that says Israel fell because of spiritual and moral failure, such an assessment is deemed to be a, shall we say, a late discovery on the part of the people, as late as at least Josiah and forward, if one assumes that Deuteronomy was first written and discovered during the reign of Josiah, or even later on into the exilic period. If, on the other hand, we understand that Deuteronomy was written closer to the era of Moses, that Moses was heavily influential in the composition of Deuteronomy, then to look at the books of 1st and 2nd Kings and say, yes, the priorities of the author here seem to be heavily influenced by the priorities of Deuteronomy, such a connection would then not cast this sort of insight as a late discovery by the nation, like, oh, they woke up in the exile and said, here's a new idea, in essence, that here are things that God was looking for that we didn't realize before. Rather, even as the book of Deuteronomy prophesies, from the outset, God indicated that he knew Israel was going to become a wayward nation. Towards the end of Deuteronomy, Moses laments. He says, after I die, I know it's going to happen to you. I know that you will cease to follow God. So, again, one's assumptions concerning authorship, even of the Pentateuch, then have an influence on how one reads the books of 1st and 2nd Kings, as far as when did Israel begin to hold these priorities or believe that these character traits of the nation were determining its fate. Another literary observation has to do with 1st and 2nd Kings vis-a-vis 1st and 2nd Samuel. And the question is, although we hold them in our current editions of the Bible as separate, and it's not just English, it would be true for the Hebrew as well, we find ourselves reading the end of 2nd Samuel and the beginning of 1st Kings and wondering, are these really separate books? Or is it not rather, perhaps, just a convenient place in the scroll to make a division to prevent the scroll from being too large and frankly unwieldy? And you can see some comments on the screen that would indicate there's a very some significant indications of carryover from the books of Samuel and then on to Kings. Since we're working in the genre of narrative, it's not surprising to find some narrative devices employed. And here's just a very small sampling. Much more could be explored. It's worth observing when we come to a narrative whether or not the names of the characters are disclosed to us as readers. And so you notice some situations where we know the name of a prominent character in an episode. And then other times when we don't know the names of these persons. Another bird's eye view, a kind of a high altitude observation of a literary sort, is simply to acknowledge that some stories seem to be more prominent based on the amount of space given to them. So, for example, first 2 chapters of 1 Kings devoted to Solomon's rise and how it is that he comes to the throne. There was a struggle there, as you may recall. So we deduce from the amount of lines, the amount of space devoted to that, this must have been important to the author. In contrast to that, the transition of power in some other cases is dispatched in just a very, very small number of words, let alone verses. How about this business of building the temple? Now, we must acknowledge that if all we're interested in is getting a list of kings, it would not have been necessary for the author of 1 Kings to have mentioned the building project as far as the temple goes. He could have just said, after a little bit of struggle, Solomon came to power, and it was a pretty prosperous reign. He was a famous person, built some things, and then Rehoboam came to power, and then the kingdom was divided. But instead, we find chapters 6, 7, 8, and 9 devoted to the construction of the temple. Consequently, we must deduce from this that this event, this project, was very important in the estimation of the writer. How about the fact that 12, 13, and 14 of 1 Kings are devoted to Jeroboam's rise to power and how this affected the kingdom, the fact that it was divided. Once again, this must be important in the scheme of the author. Not surprising. These are not great breakthrough discoveries. Think, for example, if you were writing the history of the United States, it would be unthinkable to bypass the Civil War and say nothing about that. That was very important. Well, the division of Northern Kingdom splitting off from Southern Kingdom would have been somewhat analogous to that event, a watershed event in the nation's history. How about the amount of space given to Ahab? Did you ever think about that? There's a lot of space given to Ahab and to Elijah, who runs parallel. He is the voice of God speaking into the conscience of Ahab and challenging him to turn around. And this is all Northern Kingdom. By the way, we must not get the notion that as soon as Rehoboam dropped the ball as far as how to lead the United Monarchy, and Jeroboam split off to the north, we must not get the notion that God just abandoned them. All these stories that recount how God would send various prophets like Elijah and Elisha and Micaiah and some unnamed prophets indicate how much God was interested in caring for the north. It's not, although there was some rapid rebellion against serving God wholeheartedly. And here I have in mind Jeroboam I, the founder of the northern kingdom, the fact that he's setting up, both in Bethel and Dan, he's setting up altars and worship centers because he doesn't want people to be traipsing down to Jerusalem. That would undermine the cohesion of his northern kingdom. But even though he's done this, it's not as though God cuts the northern kingdom off. It won't be until 721 that the lights finally go out in the northern kingdom, when the Assyrians roll in. Well, we were talking about Ahab and the amount of space given to his rule, though it's just one king. And so that must be significant to the writer, and the voice of Elijah coming in here, which leads to this suggestion. This is not strictly the book of the kings of Israel. This is also a book about prophets at various junctures, particularly in the northern kingdom, prophets and how they interact with the kings, how they work to rein in these kings and speak God's message into them. So it's really a book about the nation, and the nation, frankly, as it descends to eventual demise through the fall of the northern kingdom, 721, southern kingdom, 586, how God endeavors to intercept them at various points. Now, as we move down to the southern kingdom, after the northern kingdom falls, we are going to hear less voices from the prophets. Exception of that is Isaiah. Northern kingdom hasn't fallen yet, but as we noted earlier, we have acknowledgement within the book of Kings of Isaiah and his role there, the fact that Hezekiah goes to the prophet. But it will be the book of Isaiah and very prominently the book of Jeremiah that will give us a richer insight into how God was using prophets during this period of time. Jeremiah, by the way, if you're not recalling, Jeremiah presided over, during his ministry, presided over the fall of Jerusalem. So he's operating in the late 600s, early 500s, through the fall of Jerusalem. So once again, these books are not strictly about the monarchs, but it's about the nation and how politics were going one direction, and then God would send these prophets in to try and steer the kings and speak his voice into them. In the case of northern Israel, some of them are not writing prophets. That is to say, we do not have the book of Elijah, so that's known. He's known as a non-writing prophet. Whereas Hosea is operating. If you check one of your time chart, Hosea is operating at the close of the northern kingdom, analogous to Jeremiah operating, serving at the close of the southern kingdom, which explains why the messages of Hosea and Jeremiah are so vivid, so poignant, so heart-wrenching. But alas, this is not a course on the prophets. You'll have to take another course to dig into those more, read it on your own. We're dealing now in Old Testament 1, primarily with here the historical books. But I just wanted to comment a bit on the fact that these are not strictly books about the monarchs. It's God's hand in the nation, and often, understandably, that comes through the voice of a prophet. Well, we're talking about preferred stories. Elisha's ministry stretches over, look at this, from chapters 2 through 8 of 2 Kings. Very, very prominent. Hezekiah's rule, 3 chapters devoted to Hezekiah's rule. And Josiah's, a couple of chapters there. And then finally at the end of 2 Kings, the Babylonian invasion gets significant space, indicating to us how important this was in the esteem of the writer. His mission, the message he wants to transmit in written form for later people to understand about God's dealing with that nation, understanding the final demise of the southern kingdom was very important to him. Other features of a literary observation sort, then, in addition to whether or not names are disclosed and amount of space given to preferred stories, here's a situation where detail, which we understand is a feature of narrative particularly, when Jezebel is about to meet her demise, Jehu is chasing after her and fulfilling a prophecy that Ahab's lineage will be finished off. We are told that she uses cosmetics and arranges herself to be in just prime condition, I guess you might say. And we even know that she's looking out of a window so that you can visualize her when she comes to the end. She looks as beautiful as a woman could, and yet this beauty is not going to save her because it's out of sync with the interior character, we might say. She is beautiful on the outside, but not on the inside, morally. Did you notice as you've been reading 1st and 2nd Kings that from time to time the writer credits some other source, such as in chapter 23 of 2nd Kings, as he's telling the account of Josiah, he says, by the way, if you want to know more, just in essence, go to the library and check out this book. Go to this website and look it up. Well, obviously those resources weren't available, but he tells us the name of it, The Annals of the Kings of Judah. My, how we wish that we had recovered these, and perhaps someday archaeologists will recover these documents. But it gives us an idea that the writer of 1st and 2nd Kings was not addressing the history of Israel for the first time. Someone had done it before, and he is acknowledging his indebtedness to those resources. And wouldn't it be fascinating if we could have those resources along in one column or on one side of our desk, and then have 1st and 2nd Kings on the other, and we would observe then clearly what it was that the writer of 1st and 2nd Kings emphasized. I was going to say added, but it might sound like he's inventing things. But what it is that he emphasized as he retells some of these stories, which are already in this book that we have not recovered, called the Book of the Annals of the Kings of Judah. Recurring moralization. We've touched on this earlier, and we want to acknowledge that this is a key trait of the book of 1st and 2nd Kings, so much so that it's been called by some a theological history. It's a history, but it's history taught from a theological vantage. This is a bit like saying that it's the Deuteronomistic history. That would be a way of saying it's a theological history. It's a history interested in telling the reader, how did this nation behave on God's scorecard? And this is a good time for us to stop and frankly read a chunk from 2 Kings 17. I invite you to turn to that. I won't be putting it on the screen. I'm just going to read it for you. I invite you to follow along. 2 Kings 17. I'll be reading from the New Revised Standard Version, beginning with 2 Kings 17:5. Then the king of Assyria, and by the way, this would have been Shalmaneser III or Sargon II, depending on which Babylonian record you read. Different leaders take credit for this particular trouncing of the northern kingdom. Then the king of Assyria invaded all the land and came to Samaria. Keep in mind, Samaria is the capital of northern Israel. For 3 years he besieged it. In the 9th year of Hoshea, the king of Assyria captured Samaria. He carried the Israelites away to Assyria. He placed them in Halah, on the Habor, the river of Gozan, and in the cities of the Medes. This occurred, and here comes the moralization, this occurred because the people of Israel had sinned against the Lord their God, who had brought them up out of the land of Egypt, from under the hand of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. Isn't this intriguing that the writer reaches all the way back, centuries back, to the Exodus event, saying, this is how the nation got started. This is, in a sense, the debt of obedience that the people owe to God. And yet, despite that history of emancipation, the people did what? Continuing in verse 7, they had worshipped other gods and walked in the customs of the nations whom the Lord drove out before the people of Israel, and in the customs that the kings of Israel had introduced. So even the leaders are held culpable. Verse 9, the people of Israel secretly did things that were not right against the Lord their God. They built for themselves high places at all their towns. And as you know, those are places that were devoted to ritual worship, using artifacts and theology that was a stench to God. Continuing on, from watchtower, that would be a small outpost, to fortified city, this would be the metropolis, the place that's so rich that you want to guard it. So the whole range of small to large settlements were characterized by false worship. Verse 10, they set up for themselves pillars and sacred poles on every high hill and under every green tree. These would be artifacts that would be used in pagan worship. Verse 11, there they made offerings on all the high places, as the nations did, whom the Lord carried away before them. Don't you get this sense that if that was the reason that God ejected the previous inhabitants, Amorites, Hittites, Hivites, Jebusites, and so forth, it would make sense for Israel to not imitate that. And yet they did. Continuing in verse 11, they did wicked things, provoking the Lord to anger. They served idols, of which the Lord had said to them, you shall not do this. It's the simplicity of this expression is as if the writer is saying, read my lips. How else can I explain what you shouldn't do than just to say, don't do this? Verse 13, yet the Lord warned Israel and Judah by every prophet and every seer. A few minutes ago, we were talking about the fact that this book is not just a book of the succession of monarchs, but it's political leadership plus the voice of God speaking into that through the prophets. And the writer is consciously summarizing that very dynamic, that tension point. Yet the Lord warned Israel and Judah by every prophet and every seer. Hear how universal that language is. Saying, quote, turn from your evil ways and keep my commandments and my statutes in accordance with all the law that I commanded your ancestors and that I sent to you by my servants the prophets. End quote. Verse 14, they would not listen, but were stubborn, as their ancestors had been, who did not believe in the Lord their God. They despised his statutes. Hear the emotion of this language. It's not just that they said, I'm busy today, I'm going to do something else. They looked at God's statutes and said, that's junk. That's worthless to me. I despise it. And his covenant that he made with their ancestors and the warnings that he gave them. By the way, the covenant he made with their ancestors, do you have a visual that's coming to mind when you say the covenant that he made with their ancestors? You should be visualizing Mount Sinai. And if you visualize that rocky terrain, whether you've seen pictures of Jebel Musa or not, you're just thinking of some kind of hill, you ought to be visualizing it with clouds and fire and lightning and trumpet blasts and the people at the bottom just absolutely scared out of their wits and saying to Moses, I don't want to go anywhere near. This is dangerous. You go for us. In essence, we hope you'll make it, and if not, something happens to you, at least we'll survive because we're not getting close to that. That is the environment of this that the writer is trying to recall for them. When he says here, they would not listen but were stubborn, despised his statutes and his covenant that he made with their ancestors. That was very solemn and just an incredible privilege. But they despised that and the warnings he gave them. Continuing in verse 15, they went after false idols and became false. This is a principle that shows up elsewhere in Scripture. What we go after is what we become. If we go after what's empty, we become empty. They followed the nations that were around them, concerning whom the Lord had commanded them, they should not do as they did. You should not imitate them. That's exactly what they did. Does this not remind us of other parts of Scripture where God says, if you're going to follow me, you're not going to be in sync with people around you who are deliberately rejecting me. There will be a difference. Verse 16, they rejected all the commandments. This is universal, isn't it? This is, every time I run into the word all, particularly in a passage like this, we want to listen to it. We want to hear how broad is the reach of that word. They rejected all the commandments of the Lord their God and made for themselves cast images of two calves. Two calves. Now, what are these? This is not the golden calf under Aaron at Mount Sinai. No, this is Jeroboam's two calves. One at the worship center he set up in Dan to the north, and then one that he set up in the worship center at Bethel to the south of the northern kingdom. Once again, so as to discourage the residents of the northern kingdom from making the trek down to Jerusalem, where they should have been going to carry out proper worship of God. So they made for themselves, these people of northern Israel, they cast images of two calves. They made a sacred pole, worshipped all the host of heaven, and served Baal. They made their sons and their daughters pass through the fire. So sacrifice of infants, which is just breaks the heart of God. They used divination and augury. Divination, different artifacts used to suppose that they can tell the future or a divine decision apart from God. Augury is doing the same, but particularly with organs, internal organs of animals that have been killed. And they sold themselves to do evil in the sight of the Lord. Pause for a moment on that expression, to sell yourself. What kind of a scene is it when a human sells him or herself? In the ancient world, what would have brought that about? People don't do that because they have nothing better to do or think that this is going to enhance their life. People give up their own independence and freedom when they have hit such hard times, typically, that they have encountered debts that they cannot pay. And so they become servants because they cannot discharge their own debts. They become servants or slaves. And yet we have no indication that the nation has somehow hit on hard times so that they've run out of resources and had to make ends meet by hiring themselves out and becoming slaves. No, it's rather because they have fallen for the deception of the enemy and felt that it would be preferable to worship false gods instead of following devotedly the true God who powerfully had rescued them and entered into covenant with them. They sold themselves. What a sad, sad picture this is. And by the way, what will it look like for these people when Shalmaneser or Sargon are done with Samaria? These people are taken out of their lands, and that is what happens when someone is a slave. I don't think it's accurate to say they became slaves. That would be a technical term and would describe a particular relationship with a master. But in a metaphoric sense, yes, they have become slaves in the sense of losing their freedom, being jerked out of their land and forcibly relocated. They provoked him to anger. And now in 18, therefore the Lord was very angry with Israel and removed them out of his sight. None was left but the tribe of Judah alone. They're in the south, of course. Incidentally, again, a pause here, if I may. No doubt you've run into people who say it seems like the God of the Old Testament is just an angry God. Well, let's be honest. If we do a careful theology, that is to say, if we let the Bible paint the picture of God as he is in all his manifold responses to us, anger is definitely one of his traits. It's an important one, incidentally, because without anger, how can we have a God who takes care of the victim? He is angry at wrongdoing, victimizing. So anger is very important. It's part of part and parcel with justice. But take a look at the anger that God expresses here. It is absolutely crucial to look at the run-up to the anger. For those who just, in a blanket fashion, characterize God as an angry God, and sometimes I like to suggest they're so glad that God became a Christian in the New Testament. That's almost the way sometimes it's portrayed. That is such a simplistic and uninformed estimation of how God is portrayed in the Old Testament. Here's the question. How long, not does God become angry, but how long does it take before God becomes angry? Next time someone complains to you about the angry God of the Old Testament, I would encourage you to thoughtfully and sensitively pose back the question, all right, granted, God does get angry, but in specific instances, how long does it take God before he gets angry? And therein we find just the immeasurable patience and mercy of God, giving time to repent. That's why all these prophets stand in line virtually, and God says, okay, you're man up, you're next, you go to them, you keep going to the northern Israel and tell them that they're in trouble. Even tell Ahab, that fellow who's so bullheaded and ignorant and self-centered. He's just a picture of like a immature adolescent who can think only of himself and taking other people's toys like Naboth's field. God even sends this phenomenal prophet Elijah to him. That's not because God is fundamentally a God of anger. It's because fundamentally God is a God of compassion. But there comes a time when God's compassion runs out. Otherwise, he would have no, what shall we say, there would be no steel in his spine. There would be no validity to his holiness and to his desire for good for us. He would just be a piece of jello, a piece without a compass with no needle in it, no moral north. So yes, verse 18, the Lord does get angry, but my goodness, how long it takes for him to get angry. The same is true, incidentally, for the Amorites, who were the previous renters, as we might call them, in Palestine. The Amorites, God said to Abraham, within the covenant conversations there in Genesis, I believe it was 15, if I recall correctly, he says, it's going to be a land that I give to you here, but the Amorites are here right now. But over time, their time will run out. How long will that be? Well, that'll be about 400 years. And in essence, it took God 400 years to get angry at the Amorites and to say, it's time for Israel, Joshua, to displace you, move you out, and I need this territory for a new renter, for Israel. But even they were held accountable to behave morally. But instead, as the writer of Kings has so powerfully summarized, they failed. They decided to imitate the Amorites that God had displaced. And so, predictably, God responds to Israel like he responded to the Amorites. Israel does not get a free ticket, a free pass. Well, we'll continue our reading through verse 23. Now resuming with verse 19. Judah also did not keep the commandments of the Lord their God, but walked in the customs that Israel had introduced. The Lord rejected all the descendants of Israel. He punished them and gave them into the hand of the plunderers until he had banished them from his presence. Now, we are right now at the point of 721. We've still got several kings to go. And about a century and a half until we reach 586 and the lights go out in Jerusalem to the south. But the writer of Kings already knows that they are going out. They're dimming. There'll be some bright spots with occasional good kings. But the clock is ticking down for southern Israel too. The writer of Kings clearly is writing from a vantage after the fall of Jerusalem, and he reflects that knowledge here and says, the northern kingdom is not alone in suffering this demise. Judah imitated the behavior of northern kingdom Israel, and they are going to reap the same tragic result. It'll just take about 150 more years. Verse 20. We already read this, didn't we? The Lord rejected all the descendants of Israel. He punished them and gave them into the hand of plunderers until he had banished them from his presence. By the way, do you notice that? Banished from his presence. This is not a God who just says, I've got a covenant, and it's got several points, like 10 Decalogue, 10 commandments, and, check, they did these wrong, so they fail the course. No, this is a God who wants to be in relationship with them. And the tabernacle, as we've seen time and time again, the tabernacle is a model for God wanting to dwell with his people. So I find it very poignant that in this concentrated moralization passage, the grade card failure that the writer of 2 Kings is giving us here in chapter 17, one of the pieces that he pulls out, one of the expressions that he points to right towards the close here, is he banishes Israel from the privilege of being close to him. This, we might appropriately say, was the highest price that Israel paid for rejecting God. Verse 21, when he had torn Israel from the house of David, they made Jeroboam, son of Nebat, king. Now, this is recalling how the Israel northern kingdom first began, right? He's dialing back the story to the start of the northern kingdom. Jeroboam drove Israel from following God and made them commit great sin. So the writer is laying the fault at the feet of the first king of the northern kingdom. Verse 22, the people of Israel continued in all the sins that Jeroboam committed. They did not depart from them. So it's not just the initial king's fault. The people participate willingly in it. When the writer says they did not depart from them, doesn't that give you the notion? Why would he say that unless the people had the capacity to depart from them if they wanted to? Here's human choice, the human free will being engaged. We can't simply blame it on our leaders. We are responsible for our own choices as well. Verse 23 then, they did not depart from them until the Lord removed Israel out of his sight, as he had foretold through all his servants, the prophets. There come the prophets again, don't they? So important in this overall experience of Israel. So Israel was exiled from their own land to Assyria until this day. So that is something that the writer's immediate audience, whenever he's writing this, he's saying in essence, look around you. Do you see any Israelites from the northern kingdom that are still at home there? No, and here's why. That's the condition today, and I'm telling you this is why. We've taken a fair amount of time to park and slowly read through and comment on this portion of 2 Kings 17 because it's the most extensive example of the writer moralizing, giving a spiritual and a moral explanation for the demise of a portion of the people of God, in this case the northern kingdom. It's a powerful, it reads in a sense like a prophet's oracle, doesn't it? This is no bored historian. This is a historian who cares deeply about the well-being of the people and is connected to the covenant and aware of what God's law was and his expectations, the privileges he invited the people to, and deeply grieved over the fact that the experiment in the northern kingdom failed. Well, inevitably, spending this amount of time on the literary observation of recurring moralization, we've moved into theologizing, haven't we? But we need to take a look at some of the historical features of the book as well as the literary, and then we'll circle back around to theology. So the next segment of the video series will address historical features of the books of 1st and 2nd Kings.